Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you are in. Welcome to our newest, latest, and greatest webinar here at Civility Partners. Today we're going to talk about culture and compliance, how and why both drive your business success. My name is Catherine Matthijs-Sundell, and I know I get a lot of repeat webinar attendees, so thank you all for joining me again if you've been here before. If not, if you don't know who I am, I want to introduce myself to you. Again, I'm Catherine Matthijs-Sundell. I'm the CEO of Civility Partners, and I have been focused on building positive work environments since 2009 when Civility Partners opened its doors. So we've been around for almost a decade. I'm pretty excited about that. And I became interested in the topic of positive work environments because of an experience that I went through. If you've been here before, I apologize for the repeat story, but you know this. I was the director of human resources for a nonprofit organization and found myself working with a bully. And this person was just a real micromanager, really made life difficult for me and for his own department and for the whole office, honestly. And I was really fascinated by the fact that we all sort of allowed this person to act that way, including the president. The president would never speak up and say something to him about it. And so as a director of human resources, I was experiencing the organizational problems that he was creating, but then as a person, I also felt bullied. And during that time, I started getting my master's degree and ended up doing most of my research on the topic of toxic work environments, workplace bullying, and of course, ultimately how to solve that problem. So fast forward all these years later, here I am really interested and passionate about helping organizations have better thriving workforces. I have a guest here with me today. I'm pleased to announce that my husband, Nick Sundell, has come over to the dark side of entrepreneurship, and he left his previous organization to come and work with us here at Civility Partners. Nick was the previous director of sales for a background check company, and so he's come on over to Civility Partners. So Nick, say hello. Oop, I got to unmute you so you can say hello. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and say hi. Hang on one second. I have to locate your name in this very long list of names. There you are. People keep logging in. I'm so happy to have you. Okay, Nick, go for it. Say hello.
Hi, everybody. Hello.
Thank you so much. All right, so you're going to hear from Nick a little bit later because, of course, we're going to talk about background checks. And, so he's here to go over that because that's his area of expertise. So I got to say, I had a lot of coffee this morning, so I like to to be energetic on these webinars. I'm probably going to move fast. We have a lot of information to go over today, so I really recommend that you just turn everything off. I know this is a free webinar, and so I run the risk of you getting sidetracked and going off and checking an email. But this is it's a free hour for you to really get some good information about how to intertwine culture and compliance. So I really do encourage you to turn everything off, log out of your emails and all of the other things you have running in the background, and definitely pull out some paper and get out your pen. Be prepared to take some notes. Again, we're going to give you a ton of real tangible takeaways. If you've been on my webinars before, you know that I never really speak in theoretical. I really do try to give some real actionable items all along the way throughout my webinars. So be prepared to take notes. And then be sure to stay tuned till the end. We actually have an hour and a half here together, and we've got some really cool announcements for you at the end. I have one question here already. Is there a link to download the deck? There is not, so I hope that you'll stay tuned and listen in as we go through rather than focusing on downloading the deck. We will send a replay at the end, so you'll have that, and we'll also send you some tools in that replay email. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. So there are two, it says the sound is cutting out. Anything on my end that I can check? Are other people feeling that way? Let's make sure we get the sound under control. Can everybody hear me okay, or is the sound going in and out on your end? Okay, Sarah, everybody else is saying they can hear me just fine and they do not have any issues. So it sounds like it's something on your end. Someone else says I couldn't get sound, so I ended up calling in on the phone. Uh-oh. Okay, so we've got a lot of I can hear you just fine. So Sarah, maybe check your internet connection and see if that may be part of the problem. And speaking of hearing, and here we are interacting, I want to point out too that I do really try to make these webinars very interactive. This is not one of those webinars where you have to hold your Q&A till the end. If you have a question, by all means, type it in. I'm paying attention to that piece of my GoToWebinar software here. So if you have questions, please do type them in or comments, and I'll certainly ask you for comments along the way. So this is meant to be interactive. It's meant to be a conversation. All right, so I wanted you to know where this webinar kind of came from or why we were thinking about this. And one thing that I've noticed as an HR consultant who focuses on culture is that there really does seem to be two types of HR people. People like me who really do focus on culture, and then there's this other side of HR that of course is compliance. And what I found is that a lot of HR folks have a hard time balancing those two things and really intertwining the two. And it seems to me and all of the HR people that I've met all along the way that there really does seem to be this divide. So it's like either you're an HR compliance kind of a person or you're an HR people kind of a person. And so that's got me thinking because I think that's a mistake. I think one area where HR really could look at themselves and look at ways to improve in the industry is to really not see those things as two separate items. They really should be one and the same. And that's what this webinar is about. What does that even look like? How do you make compliance and culture one and the same? The other reason I wanted to do this webinar is I wanted to sort of offer a warning that intertwining culture and compliance really is important. And the reason for that is there's a mistake out there about the perception of how lawsuits come to be. And a lot of organizations or owners and CEOs especially that I've spoken to, I think HR knows better, but CEOs tend to think that employees are perfectly happy, things are fine, and then the employer makes some sort of mistake, and then employees sue. So CEOs seem to think that, well, everything seems fine. As long as we don't make any mistakes, we'll be fine. But that's not the case. The reality is that you have an angry, frustrated employee who maybe hates her boss. Maybe her boss is a bully, and the organization never really steps in to solve that. It's not an illegal behavior, so she feels really trapped, but she's unhappy and frustrated by that. And then the organization happens to do something illegal, and then she says, aha, I've got you, now I can sue you because now you've done something illegal. And I just want to highlight this. So you've probably heard of the recent Starbucks case, and it's really turned wages on their head a little bit. It's been a big thing that we've been talking about in HR. So here was this guy who felt like he was owed $102.67, and that he had unpaid time that totaled around 13 hours. And he sued Starbucks because he felt like I was doing this extra work after I'd clocked out. I still had to do some stuff that was work related, and that means that I should be paid for that. Now, I don't know, I haven't confirmed this, I haven't really seen the backstory. There isn't really any backstory about, I guess Troyster is how you say his name. But I think that we can surmise that he was probably unhappy about something. I don't think an employee who feels like they're owed $100 is going to sue an organization for the $100. What they're suing for is revenge. This, and again, I don't know, I'm just making an assumption here, but I can't help but think this guy was mad at something. And so he decided to go after Starbucks because of this extra work time. Just my opinion, but that's what I'm thinking. But I'll give you another example of this. If you get my e-newsletters, you've seen this already because I wrote an email about it. I was so frustrated when my assistant showed this to me. So Rebecca is my assistant. She works here in my office, and she received this email via LinkedIn from John over here. And John is an attorney who apparently represents employees around wage theft. And he asked her, "Are you interested in speaking to me about this?" And luckily for me, Rebecca and I have a fabulous relationship, and she showed it to me because she was also a little bit appalled by it. But you, I hope, will think about whether or not your employees would respond to John. So if John emailed any of your employees, whether or not you're perfectly legal in all of your wages and overtime and bonuses and expenses, these employees that are unhappy in your organization are going to respond to John and say, yes, I would like to talk to you. So if you have a negative culture, then John is going to come after you. Whether or not, so now you have to deal with that. And if you're doing everything perfectly legal, then great. Obviously, John won't have a case against you, but why risk it? I see a question about the recording. Yes, the webinar will be recorded or is being recorded, and we will send it out later. So are you guys with me on this? I mean, are you concerned about John? This happened here in my office. So this isn't some random story of some random person. This is a personal story about something that happened here. Does this make you nervous? And what do you think your employees would do if they received this email from John through LinkedIn? Yeah, one person saying if one person respond, then they can bring others on. Yep, so at least in California, one person can sue for the whole lot. So it doesn't have to be a class action lawsuit where every employee gets on board. If one employee decides to sue over wage theft, then they're automatically suing for everybody, and everybody will be owed money. Someone wrote, heck yes, it worries me. I'm concerned if we have disgruntled employees. Wait, gotta get back. Where'd it go? It was pretty funny. Heck yes. Heck yes, it worries me. I'm concerned we have disgruntled employees who would respond out of spite. That's absolutely what I'm getting at here. I think it would make many employers nervous. It doesn't make me nervous if we're compliant. I feel like employers who are not properly paying staff should be held accountable. For sure. And I'm not saying, if John gets to an employee who is owed wages and overtime, I'm certainly, then go after that. Employers need to be paying everyone fairly and need to make sure that people are getting what's due. But what I'm getting at is the employees who are unhappy about lots of things are the ones who are going to respond to this. So if you have a good culture, then you're less at risk for John getting to people. All right. So someone wrote, these are dangerous times. It's not just current employees, it's former ones too, for sure. All right, so let's just to reiterate what I'm saying, if you're focused on compliance, then you should also be focused on culture, because it's great that, if you're doing all of your wages the right way, perfect, you're being compliant and you don't have anything to worry about. But why go through the process of having someone like John come after you or subpoena your wage records because an employee is claiming that they're owed something? So compliance and culture really need to go hand in hand. Part of compliance is the culture piece, and that's where I feel like we've really divided between these two things, but I think they should be one and the same. So what we did for this webinar was chose some, HR topics where culture and compliance, or where we can really exemplify culture and compliance and how those two things go hand in hand. So these are the different areas we'll talk about today. Before I jump into talking about handbooks, I just want to say too that you have to think of your relationship with your employees as a partnership. And there's a lot of talk these days around employee engagement, and that's what engagement is about, right? So the idea behind employee engagement is that if you can make your employees happy, if they're engaged in their work, if they feel challenged, if they like the relationships that they have at work, the outcome of that is more production, that they'll be higher producers, they'll care more about your customers. So there's an ROI to that, but it is about building a relationship. That's why performance management conversations are changing, that they need to be more collaborative, and managers should be asking things like, how can I help you be successful? So everything's really moving towards this partnership between employees and employers, and that's where culture really comes in. So compliance need not be just about the rules and the law. It needs to be about your partnership. So let's talk about employee handbooks. Let's jump right in. So I don't need to go over the compliance parts of I can't talk. I don't need to go over the compliance parts of handbooks, because you probably had your lawyer review them, or maybe you downloaded a handbook from the handbook creator on SHRM's website. But there are some cultural things that I suspect your handbook may be missing, especially if you did do something like download it from a creator, have an employee read it, or I can't speak, an attorney go over it. There's some culture parts. So first off, you do need to make sure it ensures, make sure that it speaks to your culture. So a handbook is one of the first few things a new hire will get from you, right? You don't want to make it too boring or make it read like stereo instructions. So yes, in some ways your handbook is a legal document. It's policies that you're being held accountable to. What's in the policy and whether or not you followed your policy would be a crux of any sort of lawsuit. So certainly it is meant to be a document about compliance, but that doesn't mean that you have to ignore the culture piece of it. So for example, maybe your welcome letter could be a little more welcoming. If you're in a large organization where employees don't necessarily know the CEO personally, it might be nice to, instead of having a welcome letter from the CEO written into the handbook, it might be nice to include a link to a video where the CEO is talking and the CEO is saying, welcome to our organization. We're so excited to have you here. That would be a lot more welcoming than just the standard welcome letter signed by the CEO. It's great to include things like history of the organization, background of the organization. Really use this as an opportunity to ignite connection and attachment to your organization, because this is one of the first documents that a new employee would read. Something else to think about is making your handbook much more transformational and not so transactional. And what that means is currently your handbook probably reads very transactional. If you engage in harassment, we will investigate and you will be in trouble if the investigation turns out that there are some findings. That's all very transactional. It's very if then, your disciplinary procedure. If you do this, then you will be punished. And so that feels very transactional as opposed to relationship building. Transformational handbook is all about making the employee better, transforming them into a member of your culture and the way it is around there. So transformational handbooks really create a guide where employees are feeling cared for, and where they feel like this is a relationship. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here in a minute. I'm giving you some high-level advice here. So next up, another culture item here is to make your handbook mobile. Put it somewhere on an intranet where people can read it easily online. Everything is mobile. So if you print it out and hand it to them in a binder, but they're at home thinking of, oh, I wonder how I request PTO for that Christmas vacation I want to go on, then they should be able to pull up their phone and grab it and take a look at it. And that's, again, about building a relationship with them as opposed to it being so sort of transactional. Something else is a lot of organizations ask people who are new hires to read the handbook on their first day. So part of the training that day is they maybe go around and meet some people, and then they're left in the conference room right by themselves in silence to read through the handbook. I recommend not doing that. That's not a great way to onboard people. Instead, ask people to read through it before they come to work. Yes, that's a little pay that they're going to earn before they show up on their first day. But if you ask people to read through it when they're at home in the comfort of their jammies, then they have an opportunity to kind of take it in. And then what you might do with a new hire is try some sort of game so that they can sort of prove to you that they read it. And I'll give you an idea for a game here in a second. I would also work on explaining the why behind your rules. So, instead of saying harassment is illegal and therefore it's prohibited, why not something that's more around your culture, that your organization really prides itself on having a safe and healthy and positive work environment, and therefore, harassment is prohibited. It's important that everybody feels safe here. Having that kind of a language inside your handbook is much better than it's prohibited by law and you're not allowed to do it. Really, what does the language look like? Can you make it appear more caring? And then my last tip for you is to make it look more interesting. So you can use Google Docs, has different layouts for Word documents. Canva.com is one where you can get $1 pictures. Pexels, P-E-X-E-L, Pexels.com. You can get free pictures there. So why not add some pictures? Make it look interesting. It does not have to read black and white. So let me give you some different examples of these different tips I'm talking about. So look at the handbook on the left and look at the handbook on the right. Which would you rather read if you were a new employee? Which would you rather read? Someone said, not Acme's, with an exclamation point. I love it. Everybody's pumped up about handbooks. Okay, perfect. So this one's definitely, and it says your guide to the ins and outs. So it's a little more about how to function here as opposed to these are our policies. Here's another example. So the one on the left I just pulled from online. I love this. A fearless adventure in knowing what to do when no one's there telling you what to do. So that's a great, great title. I love that. The one on the right is one that we did for a recent client. I see a few people who know Pure Light here in San Diego. So I did their handbook recently. And honestly, I just did that in Canva, that cover, canva.com. So, make it look more interesting. Some other things around language, as we were saying. So here's something that I might put in your handbook if I was doing it for you. Just say no to harassment and discrimination. We care about you and your ability to thrive in this organization, and it's important that we all treat each other with respect and care. Harassment is also against the law, but you knew that already. So let's talk about harassment prevention. So again, it's more caring. It's coming from a place of we prohibit harassment and discrimination because we actually care about you. It's not about the fact that it's against the law. That's part of it, but hey, employee, we really care about you, and so we want to make sure that everyone is feeling safe and healthy. Here's another example of how you can make the language a little more interesting. So this is from a handbook that we did recently, in the section around the safe harbor policy. Well, this was a blue collar group. I figure anybody who's reading this handbook probably has no idea what safe harbor policy even means. So I made a joke about it, and having this more fun language in there certainly doesn't negate the legalities of the policy. It just makes it more interesting to read. I have a question here. I love this approach, but how do lawyers react to the culture-focused language? So that's a great question, Jen, and I think it depends on your lawyer. And you're not, none of this language is negating the legalities. So for example, if you start your policy off with this thing around harassment and discrimination, and it's kicked off by saying, we want people to show each other respect and care. Certainly, there's going to be sections of it that do get fairly legal. You're going to list all of the different, behaviors that might count as harassment and discrimination, and you do have to make sure there's clear language about what happens if it's reported. So I'm not saying go super crazy with it and write it as if it's a blog post, or but I am saying it doesn't have to be so legalese that people don't understand it. And I think that's part of it. Lawyers write these things, but then if your employees don't even understand what it means, then how useful is that? So I think there really is a balance, and really, Jen, I think it would be depending on the lawyer you use. I think there are plenty of lawyers who would appreciate that you're trying to bring it into a more informal, casual, fun way that gets employees to read it. So some other ideas on language. Again, speak to your employees with your partnership in mind. And this is really how compliance and culture are interacting. Do you prohibit harassment because it's illegal? Is that really the reason you prohibit it? Or do you prohibit harassment because you care about your employees? Oh, we have a comment from a lawyer. I have someone that says, I am an employment lawyer in Seattle, and I love this approach. Thank you, Anne Marie. We appreciate your comment coming in. So treat your employees, as if they're partners, and your handbook should speak to that. The language should speak to that. So something else is, don't assume negative intent. And I think sometimes these really legalese handbooks really do speak to a negative intent. That I remember a handbook actually that we had back when I worked at the organization where my bully was, that if somebody wanted bereavement leave, it wasn't me who insisted, actually it was the bully, but he insisted that his employees were required to bring in some sort of death certificate or pamphlet from the funeral to prove that somebody had died, and that's why they needed bereavement leave. That's assuming that our employees are lying to us. So let's create a handbook that reads as a partnership. So be careful about your language. Take a look at your handbook. Does it assume negative intent? Do you have a 5-page long dress code, or is it just sort of one line that says, we trust that you know how to dress appropriately, and then maybe add a few pictures about what appropriate really means? Something else to think about, what does your introduction say? So I've seen the welcome letter in the SHRM handbook creator. Not a fan of that welcome letter. For goodness sakes, please change that welcome letter if your handbook's from the creator. But look at this language. You must be awesome to have made the cut. We're so excited to have you here. This is welcoming partnership kind of language. Something else to think about is, where does your at-will policy appear? Do you have a welcome letter and then your at-will policy is only 2 pages later? So just curious, can we get some answers? Where is everyone's at-will policy? Is it at the beginning or the end of your handbook? I got one person who says it's at the beginning. Anybody else? Where does your at-will? At the beginning and in the offer letters. Okay. So, again, consider if you're sending an offer letter that says, we're so excited to have you, and your offer letter, yes, it's a legal document in some ways, but it's also meant to welcome people in. If you're putting that at will on there, how welcoming is your offer letter? So what you may want to do, if you feel the need to have that really legalese type of an offer letter, you got to include some other stuff in there in that packet, some welcoming stuff. And then you might even make a joke about it, that on the next page is your offer letter. Apologies that it reads so legally, but that it is a contract and it is what it is. But just consider, if you're welcoming new hires, are we really wanting to put the at-will policy? Welcome to our organization, and also we can let you go at any time. All right. So one last tip on handbooks is to encourage reading. So again, if you ask your new hires to read the handbook before they start working for you, before that first day, and do that only if your handbook is very culture oriented. You don't want to send them some 150 page long stereo instructions, then one way to ensure that they did read it is to kind of do a scavenger hunt. So you might, on their first day, of course, they'll need a copy in front of them to do the scavenger hunt, but you might do things like, what page is the policy on? Where is the picture of Mickey Mouse? How, are lunch breaks mandatory? And just kind of quiz them on it and make it fun. And maybe they get a little, candy bar if they answered the 10 questions correctly or whatever. So, just, find ways to make sure that they've read it. Okay, so I've got a lot of comments coming in, so give me a second. Let me pull some of these up and let's see what we got here. Okay, someone says, I respectfully disagree that it's necessary to have the at-will language in the offer letter. So Rachel, I'm certainly not saying violate laws or go outside of your comfort zone. You have to do what needs to be done compliance-wise. But what I am saying is consider the fact that having the at-will language in your offer letter could make it feel like you're not being so welcoming. So if your offer letter, that one legal document offer letter, has to have at-will language, I also recommend including a lot of other things in a packet that goes with the offer letter that are more welcoming. So, including some other welcoming things. Maybe you send along with the offer letter some swag from your organization. Maybe you send in send some sort of invitation to their welcome party on Monday at lunch, so do other things in that packet to make the welcome come across as a welcome. Does that make sense? And hopefully you agree with me on that. Let's see, what else do I see here? Our handbook is really a culture document, probably 80% culture, 20% compliance. I'm new to this company. I've never seen that approach. It's just strong culture and it's very positive. Ooh, perfect. I love that. I love it. Okay, let's see here. Ooh, someone says that their at-will statement comes right after the mission and the core values. So Melanie, could you tell me what your core values are? I'd love to hear what the core values are and then what the at-will statement, what it's coming right after. So Melanie, do us a favor and share your core values with us. One thing I wanted to do, but it was not approved, was to have a paragraph that says, when you find this, point it out for a prize. And somebody wouldn't approve it. Oh, Jen, I'll get me on the phone with whoever said no to your idea. That's a great idea. Someone else says, we use a passport system for the first 90 days with a reward upon completion. The passport requires the employee to search out specific trainers in various departments as an initiative to get the team more involved. Ooh, I love that. Great idea. Great idea. Perfect. Do you suggest the at-will at the end is the question. I don't know that it has to go, on the last page. It's obviously an important statement that needs to be in there, but what I am saying is you may not want it to appear right at the beginning, which is where you're welcoming people. So Melanie says her core values are integrity, accountability, collaboration, innovation, teamwork, and transparency. So Melanie, I'm going to challenge you. If one of your core values is collaboration, and then immediately after the core values, you're saying, by the way, you can leave whenever you want, and we can let you go whenever we want. The at-will policy, while important and needs to be in there, and I'm not discounting it, it sort of goes against that core value of collaboration. So you may not want those two things to appear one right after the other. Make sense? We all good? Ooh, someone's got an idea for language. Is it okay to phrase it more like California is an at-will state, meaning that way it's making the state more of the bad cop? Ooh, I like that. I like that. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's talk about employer branding. Oop, Melanie says she disagrees. She thinks that her at-will policy is about transparency, so it speaks to the transparency core value. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. You know what might be interesting, Melanie, is in your policy, maybe you could say, in the interest of transparency, one of our core values, we needed you to know that our state is an at-will state, and here's what that means. And that might be a way to kind of tie it back. What do you think? Okay, Melanie agrees with me on that. Perfect. All right, so let's talk about employer branding. So if you haven't heard of this phrase before, employer branding is about, essentially marketing to your internal employees as well as to the external potential candidates out there in the world. And so employer branding is kind of taking this idea of branding that every marketing and advertising company knows about. And we're really saying that as HR professionals, we got to put some marketing hats on. So branding is about 3 questions. The first question is, why would someone want to work for you? So you have to answer this question. Why would someone want to work at your organization? The second question is, what is your workforce's perception of your employer brand? So if you were to ask your employees, what's the employer brand, do they have an answer? And the third question is, are you visible to your talent pool? So are you branding yourself in a way that gets attention from the potential talent that's out there? And again, branding is about internal and external employees, those future employees. And with people changing jobs so often these days, it's important that you keep focused on your employer branding all the time. So let's talk about employer branding in the context of job postings. Which job would you rather apply for? The one on the left or the one on the right? Okay, everyone says the one on the left. Exactly. So notice that the one on the left is more fun, and it's more about branding and attracting people. So this is another place where we really have to combine culture and compliance. Obviously, there are some compliancy and legal issues around job postings and how things are worded, but I don't think they should read like a legal document. For example, you see this a lot on someone says, my baby's waking up, I gotta go, bye. We see this a lot on job postings, equal employment opportunity employer. Well, that's nice, but what about something that reads a little more culture-y, which is something like, we love our diverse workforce, we want you. So again, really thinking about, if you put equal employment opportunity employer, in my mind, and maybe it's just me, but my opinion is that this feels very like we were required to say this, and so we're going to put it here, but we don't necessarily value it or care. We had to put it there, and so there it is. That's how it feels to me, and I would venture to guess I'm not the only one, versus the second version, which is really saying we really do want a diverse workforce. Curious what you all think. Are you with me on this? That the equal employment opportunity thing feels a little too like we had to stick this here because we're supposed to? Okay, so I'm getting some agrees. So let's talk about your job postings. Let me give you some tips, ways to make them a little more focused on culture. And someone has a good point. It is required if you want to be a government contractor, and I agree with that. But it doesn't mean you have to leave it like just that, right? You can expand on it. You can talk more about diversity in other places in your posting and make it more important. Make it appear more important to you. Okay, so another good point. I think it's important for the branding to match your culture. It can't be rainbows and unicorns if your culture is grounded and practical. I agree, Mitch. So if your culture is practical, and you're not, you don't have, all the bright pink wall and the games and the free food all day type of a startup tech culture that we've been seeing a lot of. Certainly, you don't want to portray that. You need your posting to match your culture. However, I think your posting still should not read like a legal document, no matter what your culture is. You want it, it's meant to be a marketing flyer. And I've seen a lot where people post the actual job description online and use it as a job posting. And keep in mind that your job description is an internal document. It's not meant to be out there in the world on Indeed.com. Job postings are marketing and branding. So whatever your brand is, Mitch, your job description, or I'm sorry, your job posting should really match that. I absolutely agree with you. So, and I do tend to give sort of more fun types of examples. So if your organization is not that kind of fun, laugh all the time culture, that's great. That's what your culture works for you. Okay, so you do want to start your posting off with getting attention. So you might want to say something like, wanted, one amazing person who's strong in heart and generous in spirit and hungry to change the world. And obviously this may not speak to everyone's organizational culture, but it's something that will grab the attention of people who are interested in changing the world, if that's what your organization's doing. And I think most of us could probably say our organization is trying to change the world in some place, right? We're all trying to solve a problem, whatever it is our organization does. Make sure that your job posting includes information about this employee's impact on the organization, why this person would be so important. So this example here, we need you to help us maintain the quality of service our clients have come to expect and help us continue to develop our team into the road warrior sales team we know they can be. So again, it's just adding a little more interest. It's reading more like a marketing document rather than a job description. Some more tips. Make sure that you're speaking to your culture. Whatever your culture is, find some good ways to explain it. So for example, we like to have fun, but we work hard. Check out a video we made for you. So, I recommend pulling out your phone, getting people to comment and talk about what it's like to work in your organization, and then put it on your job posting, upload it to YouTube. That's employer branding, and it's very basic, giving people the opportunity to see what it's like on the inside. And then people can see, how are the people in the organization dressed? Are they having fun? What are they doing? So really give people the opportunity to see what's inside. Make sure that when you include your duties, again, I see this all the time where it's literally the job description is inside the job posting. And that doesn't make any sense to me. All this is meant to do is to bring candidates in. This is not a contract. It's not, anything legal. It's just a marketing document asking people to apply. So you don't have to read it, write it so that it's all legal and stereo instructions. So doesn't coaching team members into greatness sound a lot more interesting than managing a team of 5 people? Because really, you do need this sales manager to coach people into greatness. That would be part of their job for sure. So find some new and interesting ways to write your duties out. And then minimum requirements. Again, this is where you really have to look at how culture and compliance can work together. So there are some legal things around minimum requirements. For example, you cannot require a bachelor's degree unless it's absolutely necessary, right? But you can still have fun with it. So for example, you must have 5 years experience managing a team who kicked butt. So to Mitch's point, write job postings that speak to your culture. Maybe putting kicked butt in your job posting does not speak to your culture, but finding ways to write things out in a way that does speak to your culture. So you may even want to get your marketing team involved in writing your job postings, if that makes sense. You guys with me on this? Does this make sense? Someone says, I'm drafting one for a green card application and you must be precise and the details must be quantifiable. Okay, perfect, Lisa. I absolutely agree with you that it's not always maybe the right way. All right. So let's talk about some other branding tips. So one thing you might do inside your organization is locate brand ambassadors. So are there people inside your organizations that can speak to your brand, talk about your brand? Can they be helping you share internal stories with your external marketing efforts? So can they, if you have a holiday party, or a winter party, can people sort of take videos and take pictures, and then that can go on some sort of employer branding page. So the idea behind it is that people on the outside of your organization can see what it's like on the inside of your organization. Make sure you're communicating internally about your employer brand. So it's not just about branding to the world outside, it's about branding to the people on the inside as well. Documenting things and posting them on YouTube. Team up with your marketing group and make sure that they are helping you stay consistent. So your external marketing brand that you use for customers should match your employer brand. So the color should be the same, the language should be the same. So that's what we've got for branding. All right, so let's talk about some interview tips. So one of our core values here in Civility Partners is warrior spirit. And what that speaks to is that people who work here are expected to work hard. Everyone here will fight to the death to get things done for clients. We care very much about our clients. We're very passionate about their success. And so that's all about warrior spirit. So if I were going to be interviewing somebody new to maybe come in and work here, I would definitely be asking about whether or not people have this core value of ours. And so my tip to you is to do the same. So can you create questions around your core values and make sure that people are really living these core values all on their own, and that they really value the organization's values personally, so that they're living what it is you need them to live. Another question you might ask beyond your standard questions might be to describe the best culture you've ever worked for, so that you can understand what kind of a culture they want. And then you can decipher if the culture they're describing matches your culture or not. And if it doesn't, then they're not the right fit. I also recommend, in the interest of creating a positive, happy, and healthy work environment, that you ask emotional intelligence questions. So one question, for example, might be describe situation or circumstances that bring out your worst, and how do you behave in those moments, and how do you mitigate the damage? So that's a great question around emotional intelligence. And I've got one more for you about emotional intelligence. Tell me about a time you deliberately planned the tone of a conversation. So, your questions, there's obviously a lot of compliance around the interview questions and things you can and can't ask, but definitely a big part of your interviewing needs to be around, your brand and what you need people to care about and how you need them to behave. This slide always gets stuck for some reason on me. I need to move it this way. Okay. Something else to think about where we're talking about how culture and compliance intertwine is your pay equity. So in California, for example, I know not everyone here is from California, but for example, in California, we have a law that just passed recently that men and women have to be paid the same if they're doing the same job. And it's recommended that employers in California really audit that. And I find that fascinating, actually, because we've had federal laws around the same pay for many, 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 many years, but California is really pushing it. So consider this. Do you pay people equally because the law says so, or are you paying people equally because it's part of an inclusive work environment? So obviously, I've been talking a lot lately about harassment prevention, and one of the things I've been saying is that harassment prevention starts with prevention, right? We really have gotten really focused on the compliance training that's required But if we take a step back and consider harassment is actually a subset of discrimination, and that means if you actually really truly care about harassment prevention, you'd have to be looking at discrimination. So does your pay discriminate or not? And if there is some discrimination in your pay, and I'm sure it wasn't purposeful, but if there is discrimination in your pay, then you yourself as an organization are creating an inequitable workforce, an exclusive workforce, and therefore your harassment prevention efforts start to become moot. You guys with me on this? Does this make sense? So again, asking yourself, are we paying people equally because we have to, or because we want to make sure that everybody is happy and safe and healthy? Make sense? I got some you got it. I got a yes, some yeses. I never thought about it like that. Okay, perfect. So speaking of harassment training, I want to talk to you about that. So a lot of companies do harassment prevention training because they know it's a good idea. Certainly in California, you have to do harassment prevention training, and New York as well. And a lot of governments require harassment training. So I want to ask you to think about harassment training differently, again, in this interest of culture versus compliance. So I just did a little research online. I typed in sexual harassment training, and this is one of the first websites that came up. So I don't know interactive compliance training. I found them, and they made a great example. Take a look at this bottom sort of bullet or paragraph. It says this sexual harassment training course teaches you how to recognize and understand sexual harassment so that you can help to maintain a happy work environment free from hostility and discomfort. Let's analyze that for a second. Does recognizing and understanding harassment, do those two skills, recognizing and understanding harassment, do they actually help maintain a happy work environment? I'm curious what your thoughts are. If your managers have the ability to recognize and understand harassment, does that equate to maintaining a happy work environment? Okay, I'm getting a lot of no's. I have someone says, I think they're part of the process, but that's not an actionable item. Depends on if they do something about it. Okay, so this is part of it. Certainly recognizing and understanding harassment helps in the process of maintaining a happy work environment, but it does not actually help you maintain a happy work environment. If you want to maintain a happy work environment, then you have to do things that actually maintain a happy work environment. Here's another example. So in California, of course, we have our required trainings. And so this is from Cal Chamber. It's a checklist to help you make sure that all of your training is compliant with the law. And check it out. There's this only one little teeny tiny section, strategies to prevent sexual harassment. So most of the training is about the law and how the law defines harassment and what the employer's responsibility is for dealing with harassment. Something I saw a lot in the Me Too movement was around see something, say something. So there were, of course, a lot of articles for employers about what to do now that we were in a harassment Me Too era here. And a lot of the advice said, we'll create a see something, say something culture. Well, that's a lovely piece of advice. But now we're talking about culture. So see something, say something is not just a skill where you can tell your employees, hey, if you see something, we want you to say something. There has to be a lot of other cultural things in place in order for that to happen. So let me just give you some examples. So I do the sexual harassment training here in California, and I'll just say this in case you didn't know, any Californians on the webinar. In California now, employees, if you have 5 or more employees, then they need to be trained. So it's no longer the 50 plus managers and supervisors only. If you have 5 or more employees, you have to train your employees and of course the managers and supervisors as well. So let's talk through this. So in my harassment prevention training, I go through all the compliance stuff. If I did your training, you could certainly check the box. But I also talk about actual true prevention. So setting behavior expectations. So in the manager version, we go over all the compliance stuff, but we also talk about how to set expectations for behavior. We also talk about managing and coaching incivility. So, a lot of times harassment does not just start in, with this aggressive harassment right off the top. It usually escalates over time. So that means that your managers need to know how to manage and coach, you know, incivility, something that's minor, but that can lead to harassment. That would be true prevention. And then also we do a lot of training around creating a positive environment. So I actually teach as part of my compliant harassment training how to create an environment that doesn't tolerate that type of behavior. So if the manager is really focusing on building a positive work environment, then there won't be harassment. And then employees or everyone, your entire organization from top to bottom needs some other skills around, inclusive behavior and what that looks like, learning things like implicit bias. So learning some other tools past the compliance stuff. We also literally give employees or everyone, this is the company-wide version, training on what to say and how to say it. So I literally give them 3 things to say in the moment if you are experiencing or witnessing inappropriate behavior ranging from incivility on up. Here are the 3 things that you would say in that moment. And then we talk about assertiveness, and we talk about reasons that you might be afraid to speak up and how to overcome that. So we really talk about prevention, and so I'm encouraging you to do the same. So this is another example of where culture and compliance really are intertwined. Do you do the harassment prevention training because you have to, or do you want to do it because you actually care about whether or not it's being prevented? Someone's asking, is my harassment training in a classroom setting? It is, and in 2019, we'll be working on a version that will be online, because I know that'll be important. But for now, yes, it is in the classroom. And I'll just throw this out there too. If you're really focused on checking the box and making sure you're being compliant, then stick with the online version. But in my training, we do role play and we talk about emotions, and it's just so much more powerful if it's in person. Consider this. I think that our problem these days is that harassment has really become something that's a compliance problem. That's how we talk about it. It's a compliance problem. If somebody complains about harassment, you pull out your policy and you follow your policy and you call your attorney to make sure you're doing it right. That's all compliance stuff. But what about how this person feels? So it's an emotion problem. It's a people problem, and compliance is an aspect of that. But you have to start to see harassment as a people problem, and you got to handle it that way. And that means that the training would be in person, and that's much more powerful. Now that said, I know logistically that may not always work, but if I've honestly been doing offering to do webinars at least so that they're live and we can still have some interaction live. People can still talk live as opposed to doing it in an online, Captivate type of a class. Okay, so just to be clear, all staff need to have sexual harassment training. That is correct. So if you're in California and you have 5 or more employees, the entire organization needs to be trained for an hour. All of your employees need an hour-long training, and then your managers and supervisors still need their 2-hour trainings. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Oops. Sorry, give me a second. Someone says, I'm in California, so we're scrambling to get employees trained according to the new mandates. How would you recommend we proceed Or how is your offering different? That's a great question, and this is the answer. So I will help you check your box, your compliance box, but I'll also actually give your employees quite a bit of tools for you know, preventative behaviors. Someone says, does this have to be every year? No, it's still every 2 years. So what's changed is if you have 5 employees now rather than 50, and that now employees need to be trained too. But the managers still get their training every 2 years, and now employees need to get their training every 2 years. Okay, let's talk about employee rewards. So this is maybe a little less compliance and definitely more culture. However, there are some client compliance issues that go into rewarding employees. It certainly has to be fair and consistent. So I wanted to give you some ideas about rewarding employees. So one is to really consider your culture as you're thinking about what kinds of employee rewards you want to give. You know, what message do you want to send to your employees? Just to give you an example, we have a client right now who has a extra mile award. That's what they call it, the extra mile award. Well, the reason we're working with them is they have a lot of burnout and turnover because they work their employees hard. They are in the business of crisis communications. People have to be on call 24 hours, basically. They work in the political arena, so there's a lot happening all the time. It's a high stress environment. Well, people are burnt out, and that's why they leave, but then they have this rewards called the extra mile. So we've talked about the fact that if you that extra mile kind of sounds like if you work hard or stay late, then you can get the reward. So we're working with them to change the name of that reward so that it's not about working harder. We've got to find something else that speaks to this new culture that they're trying to create, that is more focused on work-life balance. So consider, what message are you sending with your rewards? Set milestones and goals, and reward people. So if you have some grandiose goal for people, sales is a good example. If you have a grandiose goal for your sales team to increase sales by 10% this year, then all throughout the year they should have milestones all along the way and being rewarded when they hit the milestones, and that'll help ensure that they actually achieve the big milestone at the end of the big goal. Make sure that it's really clear how to get the reward. And actually that same client, one of the problems is people didn't really know how it worked, or who could nominate who. And so, we had to work with them on communicating around the reward system so that people could understand it better and understand how it's supposed to happen. And then just really following up to ensure people are on the right track. So again, my same question stands. Do you have a reward system because you feel like you're supposed to, and you want people to produce, or do you have a reward system because you actually want to celebrate your employees? So consider the context of your reward system, and you really have to set people up to succeed. So if you're going to have a reward system, the idea should be that most people would be able to achieve it. So just some ways to give rewards. You have to consider that there are 3 types of rewards. The first one is your formal rewards, and that would be things like honoring years of service, sales incentives, rewarding quality standards, honoring somebody who gets a note from a customer, so those are the more formal rewards. Informal rewards are more like on-the-spot recognition, calling someone out in a staff meeting without them knowing it was coming, giving someone a handwritten letter. I had an old boss that was really good at this. He was really into cars, and he would have a detailer come to the workplace and detail his car. And he would sometimes just kind of pop his head in and say, hey, Joe's here. If you want to drive your car around, he'll detail it. And so he would just have people's cars detailed as an informal reward. It was just a way for him to sort of call you out. And then daily rewards. So it's important, if you're going to build a positive, happy work environment, that you also reward people daily and talk about it daily. So, have an exchange with people during lunch and then buy them lunch. Make sure you're greeting your employees. Spontaneous visits to a desk to say thank you. So just keeping in mind that if you're going to build a positive, happy work environment that's got a positive culture, that means you have to acknowledge people regularly, as you're, building this type of culture. All right, so we are going to move over and talk about background checks. So enough of me. I'm going to hand you over to Nick. Let me unmute you, Nick. Hang on one second. Oh, you're unmuted. All right, Nick, go for it.
All right. Hi, everybody. So background checks, and since we're all on a webinar focused on compliance and culture, I'm gonna make a stretch and assume that everybody here is part of the roughly 2/3 of companies in the country that are actually doing background checks. If you're not, give me a call. Seriously, give me a call. I've got some horror stories that you should probably hear. But those of you that are doing background checks, it's crucial to understand that not all background checks or even criminal background checks are created equal. The specifics of the search you are doing are important, especially if you're in a regulated industry or have client contracts that dictate the type of searches that you perform. A couple of years ago, I was speaking with a healthcare provider who thought they were doing a quote unquote comprehensive criminal background check. And one day they had a new hire, and later on in that day, they had a bunch of people come into the HR office and tell them that they had just hired a murderer. Well, turns out their comprehensive criminal check did not include searching for federal criminal records where this individual's conviction record was held. And so they lost a lot of credibility as an employer in taking care of their employees. And then that goes back to your culture just as well. So it's important to understand what you're doing in that regard, so that when you do hire people, you're bringing in the right people. The correct people is the foundation of creating that positive culture. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple compliance areas. Ban the box. A lot of people probably have already heard this. There's versions of Ban the Box initiatives in about 33 states and over 150 cities around the country. Roughly 3/4 of the population in the United States is covered by some sort of Ban the Box initiative. I won't go into too much depth, but the gist of it is looking to help reduce recidivism and get people back into the workforce and back into society. And so removing conviction-related questions from job applications and initial interviewing and delaying the background check until later on in the process so that you actually get to know who the person is and whether or not they're a good fit for the organization before you're doing a background check to confirm that they are. To clarify, there's the basics of Ban the Box is about the same across the nation, but there are a few areas that have some additional requirements. New York, Los Angeles, a few other jurisdictions. So be sure to check with your attorney to make sure that you understand what's being required of you, whether there's an individualized assessment or anything else that goes along with that.
Hey, Nick, we have a couple questions.
Sure.
So one question says, at what point do you give someone a second chance while still maintaining the safety of the workforce?
That's a good question. So it really is an individualized assessment of what your industry is, what the threat that person poses to your business, and the situations around what happened. If it's something that, let's say it's petty theft from 7 years ago and they're not going to be around any valuables, then that charge probably doesn't relate to the role and is not necessary. However, if this is someone that may have a murder charge or a sexual assault charge, and there's a chance that they can be left alone with someone in your office or someone in the building, then that's something that you want to take into consideration. And that may not be something where you're willing to take the risk on taking a second chance on that individual.
Okay, and then one other question. I can't make the business case for background checks for our manufacturing facility other than negligent hiring. So Nick, maybe you have some ideas on how to get past that. What else other than negligent hiring might be a good way to make a business case?
So negligent hiring is a big piece of it. I've got some horror stories that Catherine's heard some horror stories that I've come across over the years. Um, but it also goes to the culture piece of it and the fact that you care about the people in the workplace. If you have someone that is making poor decisions in their life time and time again, if it's a manufacturing facility, theft could be an issue. If they have alcohol-related offenses, if they have a ton of DUIs, there's a good chance that that individual may have a drinking problem. And while you've done a drug and alcohol test before you hire them, there's a higher likelihood that that person could have some issues with alcohol down the road. So it's really tying it into the role that you have. I'd love to have a deeper conversation, understand what kind of manufacturing it is, but each one, there's a way to tie it back in and the costs associated with it when you look at the cost of a negligent hiring lawsuit or even just the loss of credibility with your current employees and clients, it really is negligible. It's a very minimal cost for a background check in the long haul.
So you could kind of prove that, hey, if we're charged X dollars per background check, but a negligent hiring case is going to cost us this, it's like insurance. It's really worth the risk. So Catherine, why don't you, Nick's contact information will be on towards the end. If you want to have a deeper conversation with him, then he could maybe understand a little more what you're up against and what the naysayers are really saying, and then give you some ideas on how to get past that naysaying. So one last thing, and then we'll move on. Stephanie says she actually had the reason she asked about giving someone a second chance is she had someone from prison mail a letter saying that this person has the experience to perform the role they have. He was in prison for 30 years. He's going to be released, and could he apply? And she said yes. So she's wondering if she should hire him or not. And maybe I'll start by saying it depends. If he murders someone else that works in your organization, you're going to be on the hook. But Nick, maybe you have some other
Yeah,
some
so
other thoughts.
kudos to you, A, for, it's important that we as a society help people get back into society and be productive members. Um, Years ago, I had a call center that I was managing, and one of my best employees had made a horrible choice for, way back in his life, and he had been in prison for about 25 years. Well, this individual did great at sales, and he did very good at a specific set where he set appointments for vending companies. That was what he just did amazing at. He was an amazing employee, knew about his history, but by knowing about his history, I also knew that I wasn't going to I wasn't going to go out for drinks with the guy. I wasn't going to leave him alone with anybody. And I was going to take certain precautions to make sure that I was aware of what was going on with it. He was one of the best employees I've had and probably the best appointment setter I've seen in my entire career, and I've seen a ton of them. So the key is to understand what that situation is, the risks that it poses, and how does that relate to the role. If you'd like to have a further conversation, we can talk it through and gives you some tips on how to think about it. I don't want to say yes or no on hiring without knowing, and I can't really say that anyways, but um, I think if they're a good fit for the role and they can do the job and the risk associated with hiring that individual is minimal, go for it. But you need to know what the background of that is. Sound good?
All
All
right,
right.
let's move on.
Okay. So we're on to authorization disclosure forms. Do them, get them, sign them. Uh, there's a couple areas that I'm kind of shocked that I come across companies that don't get authorization disclosure forms, but they do background checks. It kind of surprises me. For those of you that don't know, an authorization disclosure form, you're disclosing to the candidate that you're going to run a background check on them, and you're getting the authorization to actually do so. Um, your screening provider should be auditing your forms based on your volume from time to time to make sure that they're helping you out. But at the end of the day, the ownership is on you, the employer, because every time you submit an order, you're certifying to your background screening provider that you've obtained the correct authorization and disclosed that you're going to be doing this. But most companies haven't looked at their forms in just years, many years. In addition to federal authorization disclosures, many states have additional specific requirements for disclosures. In California, for example, there's an entire additional document that's required if employers before they run a background check. Well, recently I would say about 2, 3 weeks ago, I was talking to a staffing PEO firm based in California. They do about 80% of their business here in California. And as we were going through and assessing their screening program, they've sent over their documents, and the biggest glaring issue was that they didn't have anything related to California disclosures. And this is a company that's been with their provider. They are with a big name provider. They've been with them for years. The problem is they've been with them for years and they haven't reviewed those documents. And so it's extremely important that you're staying on top of that and working with a partner that is actually keeping you compliant in that regard. A couple quick pieces. These need to be standalone documents. They cannot be part of the application. And you cannot have liability waivers in there. The same client, the same PEO firm had a huge section on liability waivers, waiving liability for them doing a background check. That type of verbiage makes an attorney salivate. They love it because they know right from the get-go that they can go after you. So some key tips on this is keep it easy and legal. If you're using an ATS or an HRIS system, a lot of them have functionality where you can get authorization disclosures electronically signed. If you don't want to pay, if it's an extra module you don't want to pay for or you don't have that, any reputable screening provider is going to have an e-signature feature, candidate invite feature. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's a great way to make sure that you're collecting the correct documents, it has the correct verbiage, and that almost most importantly, that you have easy access to them in the event of an audit or a lawsuit so you can protect yourself. I
All
know we
right,
had
Nick,
some
real
questions on
quick,
the last one.
we have a couple more questions. So one is, I always offer the prospective employee a copy of their disclosure. They rarely accept. Should I just print it and hand it to them and stop asking them? Quick yes or no.
Yes. A lot of disclosures have a signature portion to it, but yes, give it to them no matter what.
Okay, and then the other question is, are these standards you're speaking of the same for all states or just California?
California has some additional specifics. All states are required to have let me back up. Federally, there is authorization disclosure across the entire nation. That's mandated by the FCRA. That's mandated by the FCRA, but California is one that has its own specific. There are a few other states out there that we can get into. If you want to reach out, we can take a look at that.
All right, perfect.
All right, pre and post adverse action notices. This is another wonderfully fun area that I'll try and be pretty brief on. So let's first define pre. It means before, as in before an adverse action or decision not to hire has been taken. This is where you have an inkling that you're not going to be moving forward with the candidate, but want to give them or are giving them the opportunity to dispute the information. Could be a wrong candidate, a junior senior situation, a dismissed or expunged record. There are a lot of reasons that it could happen. One personal example of this is I always thought I was this special snowflake, one of the only Nick Zundells in the world, and guess what? I'm not. When I was in college, I was in one of those 200 plus person classrooms that we all have to take. And at the beginning of one of the classes, professor said, can both Nick Zundells come see me after class? And I always thought I was one of the only Nick Zundells in the world, let alone only one in Las Vegas, Nevada. Well, um, turns out I wasn't. He same name, around the same age, around the same place that we lived. The point being is that there's a lot of ways that records can get mixed up, or it could be someone in the court system that has fat fingers. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right information on the person so that you can attract and retain all those great people that you want. So after you wait a reasonable amount of time, most companies go with the industry standard of 5 business days. You can decide to take the action to not move forward with the candidate and send out a post-adverse action notice as well. Quick tip, reputable screening providers should be giving you templated notices, summary of rights, and copies of the report that you can provide. Make sure you're being consistent and make sure you're able to prove that those documents were provided at the right points in time. That is crucial. All right. So how does this all relate to culture? So we talked a little bit about culture earlier, but having the right people is the foundation of your culture. At the very basic level, doing a background check shows your employees that you care about the details. Most importantly, you care about their safety, you care about their security. Beyond that, this is their first experience interacting with you after they've accepted the role. Your employer brand is on the line. They are not differentiating between you and the background screening provider. To them, it's all one, it's all you. So they're judging you, they're grading you right from the get-go on how easy is it to fill out the form and submit it. Is there an integration? How convenient are the drug testing locations? How long does it all take? Even a squeaky clean candidate gets worried because if it goes too long, then they may not be able to start on time and that impacts their paycheck. Are their references treated respectfully? Can they have a clear and consistent piece of communication with them when they're trying to give a great reference on them? Or are they being rudely treated? And last but not least, are they being treated respectfully when something weird happens? Because it always inevitably does happen. There's going to be something weird that happens, whether it's a delay, a weird record, or a question that they have. You want to make sure that they're being treated respectfully and appropriately by your partner as an extension of your employer brand as well. So, got a couple choices. You can worry about the compliance aspect, worry about the accuracy of what you're doing, or how your partners or your providers affecting your employer brand, or do a painless review of the program. Look for the gaps, correct the gaps, and rest assured that your screening partner is looking out for you.
All right, so we want to introduce pre-employment screening by Civility Partners. So with Nick coming over here, having this experience as a director of sales for a background check company, we are, as you heard, Nick is very knowledgeable on background checks, and the process of having them done and getting them going is definitely a big part of building the right culture. So Civility Partners is your partner dedicated to preserving your employer brand and company culture through your background checks. It's part of your onboarding process. So if you were to bring on Civility Partners as your background check partner, your employment screening partner, we would start by reviewing the current pre-employment screening program that you're working with. For example, I am working with a client here in town in San Diego on some culture change, and part of the process was bringing in an employee who could do more HR and be more people focused. And so they switched background check companies and came on board with us. And Nick discovered that they had already been missing out on 3 different areas where they should have been screening previously. So lucky for them, Nick was able to kind of review what they'd been doing and really offer some great ways to improve. We offer electronic authorization and disclosures, or we can integrate those things into your ATS. Nick will help you manage your adverse action letters and all of the things that you need to do. We'll give you some personalized service. Nick promises to know who you are and know your first name. A lot of these larger background check companies just, they're machines. They're like credit reporting agencies. They just pump out data. Nick really understands the in and outs of background checks in a different way, so he'll give you a lot of proactive support. He'll make sure that your different documents and authorization forms are up to date and that you have what you need. And speed, I know, is a big part of the hiring process, and Nick can give that to you. So Nick, I'll let you talk about the process.
Yeah, so if this is something that interests you, if you just want to take a look at your program, reach out, send me an email. You have my contact information right there. But we'll schedule a 30-minute chat, review your current program, assess it from both a culture standpoint, how it's affecting your employer brand, and also, very importantly, a compliance standpoint. If it's something that we decide to move forward together with, we'll, I promise, as Catherine mentioned, personalized, handheld implementation process, train your team, support your team on an ongoing basis. In the first couple weeks, depending on your anticipated, how often you order. I like to check in weekly, make sure that it's working for you, and then we will work towards periodic reviews. As Catherine said, we do have some specials for everyone that cares so much about compliance and culture. I want to give you something additional. In addition to making sure I give you some great rates, give you an additional 20% off your first month if you sign up by the end of this month as well.
So we have one question here. How much? Cost is always a factor.
Good question. Cost is always a factor. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's key to understand the risks that the role and your organization is facing, and then tie that back in. So that all plays a portion into it. Reach out, let's have a chat. I don't think I've ever been beaten. So.
Okay, one other question. Can the provider of background checks really make that much of a difference?
Good question. My firm belief is they can. If they're missing records, if they haven't given you the right service, if go back to the story that I mentioned earlier where a healthcare provider thought they were doing a quote unquote comprehensive check and they hired a murderer, that ruined their reputation internally with their employees. So their employees don't trust them anymore, and that damages their employee brand or employer brand. So my personal view is I believe the right background screening provider plays a huge part in your employer brand.
All right, awesome. Okay, so I had one other announcement for you. So you all know me as a culture consultant. Of course, I'm very focused on building positive work environments. And through all of that, really thinking more about how compliance and culture intertwine, we have brought on a compliant-focused HR outsourcing professional because I personally am not, it's been so long, I'm not a compliance person. I am more on the culture side. So she and I are working together to be able to bring my clients some compliant HR that still has the culture twist on it. So for example, if you wanted us to update your handbook, she'd be happy to do the handbook for you, make sure it's compliant, and then I add the culture twist to it. We do HR compliance audits, best practice audits. We can help you with your performance management, make sure that it's speaking to your culture and that it's more collaborative. We can help ensure your job descriptions are up to par. So really any of the standard HR services that you might be thinking of, we're happy to offer those to you and help ensure that the compliance stuff that you're doing is also helping you build the right kind of a culture and employer brand. We're also opening up an unlimited HR advice hotline essentially. So for an annual fee of $1,500, we would be happy to be your go-to unlimited HR guidance counselor. And of course, we're also doing the California Compliant Harassment Prevention Training. So I wanted to make that announcement as well. So it's been a big year for us, bringing on background checks and now bringing in the more typical HR outsourcing. One question, do you do handbooks for states other than California? We do indeed. My HR partner that I've brought on, she has been in HR for 17 years and has done some global HR. So she is absolutely capable of doing all of these things. So with that, we have a few more minutes here, so we'll take a few more questions. If anybody has any questions, any comments or thoughts about the things that you've heard today. So here's a question. How do you convince leadership to go beyond the compliance side? The culture aspects you've shared are great, but I'm not sure if my boss would support putting extra time into things like the handbooks. That's a great question, and it certainly depends on your leader. If you have somebody that's just so focused on the numbers and the budget, those people are hard to push in the right direction. And sometimes it takes a big kerfuffle for them to pay attention. We're working with a big organization right now where they had a very public kerfuffle, and the leader, who is much like what you're describing, kind of the more compliant, just moving along, doing our business kind of a guy, he's having a real hard time with it, and it's been a big shock for him. And so he's found himself in a bit of a Me Too movement type of a problem. And so I think there are a few things that you can do to convince your C-suite to go past the compliance, which is talk to them about whether or not they've ever worked for an organization that treated people poorly. Have they ever worked with a bully? Have they ever worked in a situation where they felt mistreated or disrespected? And how did that affect them personally? Did it affect their performance? So if you can get them to kind of think back to themselves and their performance, you might be able to help them understand that that's how the rest of the employees that they're leading feel. So that's one option. And you can certainly speak to the costs of continuing to do things the way you're doing them versus having the right kind of a culture. So, people are leaving organizations every 3 years these days. So you need to be able to catch that top talent. So having a big conversation with them around how important culture is. I mean, it's literally all the rage right now. So there's a lot of information online. Got another question. How do we convince executives our culture needs fixing? They think culture is organic and doesn't require work, so they aren't interested in spending money on investing in culture for 800 restaurant workers. Hillary, that's a great question, and I would start with a climate assessment, and we are happy to do that for you. So we don't need to do some big culture proposal. It could just be, a conversation where it's more like, well, hey, you're saying you don't think culture needs fixing. I'm saying I think there's room for improvement. Let's do a very cost-effective climate assessment, and let's see what the employees think and kind of go from there. So Hillary, if you want to shoot me an email, it's just info@Civility Partners, then we can talk more about that. Lynn asks, can you identify or clarify the harassment training requirement for 5+ employees? Yes, so in California, if you have 5 or more employees, your employees all need to receive an hour-long harassment prevention training, in addition to the 2-hour-long training that the managers and supervisors would need. So previously it was 50 employees, managers and supervisors got a 2-hour training. It's now 5 employees, managers and supervisors get a 2-hour training, and everybody else gets an hour-long training. Nick, should you still do background checks even if they aren't required?
Yes. Going back to the employer brand, it shows that you care. It's key to understand the threats and the risks of the person that you're hiring and putting them in a position where they're going to be successful. So I wholeheartedly believe it is important.
All right. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Definitely reach out to Nick. Take advantage of his very amazing offer to cut you a deal and on your background checks. So not only will you have better service and a better program, it'll be more cost effective. You can't beat that. So thanks again for being here with us this morning. I got one last question on that California training. It is by January 1, 2020. So in the year of 2019, your 5 employees need to be trained. So Lynn, shoot me an email and we can talk more. I can give you more on the lowdown. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today.